September the 15th, 1959. Andrews Air Force Base, just outside Washington, D.C. The press had been waiting since early morning. Cameramen from every major American network, reporters from wire services across the world, a full military honor guard, soldiers in dress uniform, rifles polished, standing at attention in the late summer heat, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, standing on the tarmac, hands clasped, looking toward the far end of the runway. This was the day. The first visit by any Soviet leader to the United States of America. Nikita Khrushchev, unpredictable, theatrical, the man who had banged his shoe on a desk at the United Nations, was coming to Washington. And he was coming by air. They heard it before they saw it. A sound. Not the clean whistle of a jet engine, which Americans had grown accustomed to by the late 1950s. The Boeing 707 had entered service the year before. Jet travel was the future. Sleek, modern, fast. No, this sound was something else entirely. A deep, churning roar, heavy and relentless. A grinding, percussive howl that seemed to come from every direction at once, growing louder as the source drew closer. It was the sound of propellers, umbrutrai, enormous propellers, beating the air at speeds that defied what propellers were supposed to do. And then, through the haze, the shape of it. 4 engines mounted on swept-back wings, 8 sets of propeller blades spinning in opposite directions, contra-rotating, the engineers called it. 4 blades clockwise and 4 counterclockwise on each engine. 32 blades total, each one 5.5 meters from hub to tip. Wings swept back at 35 degrees, the same angle you'd find on a Boeing 707. But this was no jet. This was something from a different imagination entirely. A propeller-driven aircraft, the size of nothing anyone at Andrews had ever seen taxi to a gate. The Tupolev Tu-114 Russia, registration CCCPL 5611. The largest, fastest, longest-ranged passenger aircraft on Earth. And it had just flown non-stop from Moscow, roughly 5,000 miles across the Atlantic, carrying the leader of the Soviet Union on the most politically significant flight of the decade. The aircraft rolled to a stop. The engines wound down slowly, reluctantly, the way a great machine cools after tremendous effort. The propellers slowed, their blur resolving into individual blades, massive, paddle-shaped things that seemed too large for anything meant to fly. Ground crews moved forward with the passenger stairs, and then the problem. The stairs weren't tall enough, not even close. The Tu-114 sat so high off the ground, its nose landing gear alone stood 3 meters tall, higher than a basketball hoop, that the standard American boarding stairs, the same ones used for every other aircraft at Andrews Air Force Base, couldn't reach the forward hatch. The door was up there, somewhere near the level of a second-story window, and the best stairs the Americans had topped out well below it. Nothing at Andrews Air Force Base could get Nikita Khrushchev from his airplane to the ground. Can you picture it? The most powerful man in the communist world, arriving to meet the most powerful man in the free world, a visit that would shape the trajectory of the Cold War. And he can't get off his own plane. The cameras are rolling. The honor guard is waiting. Eisenhower is standing in the sun, and Khrushchev is stuck. In the end, the Soviet delegation opened the aircraft's emergency escape hatch, and Khrushchev and his party climbed down the airplane's own emergency ladder, a narrow, steep, thoroughly undignified thing. The Premier of the Soviet Union, the man who controlled the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth, descended a ladder meant for crash evacuations, while the American press recorded every awkward step. Eisenhower waited at the bottom. The two men shook hands. A 21-gun salute was fired. The honor guard presented arms, and 4 Tu-114’s. The Soviets had brought 4, specifically to counter Western speculation that only one existed, sat in a line on the tarmac, their swept wings catching the September light. It was awkward, it was absurd, and it was, in its own peculiar way, magnificent. We bring back the days when the journey meant just as much as the destination, the ships, the trains, the stories worth remembering. If you'd like to come along for the ride, subscribe. We've got more of these waiting for you. Now, let's continue. Because what nobody in that crowd at Andrews fully understood, not the journalists, not the generals, not even Eisenhower himself, was what waited inside that aircraft. What lay behind the fuselage walls of this giant Soviet machine? An interior that, when Western observers finally got a close look, defied every assumption about Soviet aviation and Soviet life. Sleeping compartments with beds, real beds, 2 lower berths and an upper berth in each compartment, arranged like a European railway couchette. Small tables, reading lamps mounted on the walls, curtains for privacy. A restaurant cabin in the midsection of the aircraft, with 8 tables set for 6 passengers each, face to face, exactly like a dining car on the Orient Express. A full kitchen on a lower deck, accessible by an internal staircase, staffed by a chef who cooked meals from scratch at 25,000 feet. And a dumbwaiter, a small service elevator carrying those meals upward through the cabin floor to the passengers above. This wasn't just an airplane, this was a flying sleeper train, a parallel universe of airborne comfort that existed entirely behind the Iron Curtain, unknown to most of the Western world, built from the wings and engines of a nuclear bomber. And for 15 years, it carried over 6 million passengers across some of the longest, most improbable routes on Earth. This is its story, and almost nobody outside Russia has ever heard it told. To understand the Tu-114, you have to understand the man who built it. And to understand him, you have to understand something rather extraordinary about the history of Soviet aircraft design. Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev was, by the mid-1950s, the single most important aviation designer in the Soviet Union. He'd been building airplanes since the early 1920s, enormous ones, ambitious ones, record-breaking ones. His AN-T-20 Maxim Gorky, built in the 1930s, was the largest land-based aircraft in the world, with 8 engines and a wingspan that dwarfed everything else in the sky. His bureau traced a line from the earliest days of Soviet aviation through every major era of the industry, but there was a darker chapter. During Stalin's Great Purge of the late 1930s, Tupolev was arrested on fabricated charges of sabotage and treason. He was sent to a Sharashka, a prison labor camp for scientists and engineers, where inmates worked on state projects under guard. And there, behind barbed wire, Andrei Tupolev designed one of the finest medium bombers of the Second World War, the Tu-2. He created a weapon of extraordinary effectiveness, while imprisoned by the very government that needed it. That was the kind of man Tupolev was. You locked him up, and he designed bombers. You set him free, and he designed airliners. The distinction for Tupolev was less dramatic than you might think, because in the Soviet aviation industry of the 1950s, bombers and airliners were not entirely separate things. He'd already proven the concept once before. In the early 1950s, his bureau had taken the Tu-16 twin-jet bomber, NATO codename Badger, and transformed it into the Tu-104, one of the world's very first jet airliners. When the Tu-114 appeared without warning at London's Heathrow Airport in March 1956, Western observers were stunned. The Soviets had a jet airliner in service before the Americans did. It was a propaganda triumph of the First Order. If a bomber could become a passenger plane once, why not do it again? Only bigger. Much bigger. The directive came in August 1955 from the Soviet Council of Ministers and the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Order number 1561-868. Build an airliner with intercontinental range, at least 8,000 kilometers, enough to cross continents and oceans without stopping. Build it fast, billed it as a flagship for Aeroflot and a symbol of Soviet technological achievement. The nation needed something to show the world, and the need was personal as much as it was political. Just 2 months before that directive was issued, at the Geneva summit of July 1955, Nikita Khrushchev had arrived to meet Eisenhower and the other Western leaders. The Americans came in Columbine 3, the presidential C-121E, a 4-engined Lockheed Constellation, gleaming and impressive. Khrushchev arrived in a twin-engine Ilyushin IL-14, a perfectly adequate propeller transport that looked parked beside the American delegation's aircraft, like a dinghy next to a yacht. Khrushchev never forgot that humiliation. Never. He would not be upstaged again. Tupolev's answer was characteristically bold. He would take his greatest military creation, the Tu-114, NATO codename Bear, the Soviet Union's first truly intercontinental nuclear-capable strategic bomber, an aircraft designed to carry atomic weapons to the American heartland and return home. And he would turn it into a passenger airplane. Now, it should be said that this was not entirely unprecedented. Boeing had derived the 307 Stratoliner from its B-17 Flying Fortress and the 377 Stratocruiser from the B-29 Superfortress. Avro in Britain developed the Lancastrian and Tudor airliners from the Lancaster bomber. Turning military aircraft into civilian ones was, in aviation history, a recognized tradition. But the scale of what Tupolev proposed was something new. The Tu-114 Bear was no ordinary bomber. It was one of the most extraordinary aircraft of the Cold War. Enormous, powerful, designed to fly intercontinental distances at speeds no propeller aircraft had any business achieving. It was powered by 4 Kuznetsov NK-12 engines, each generating nearly 15,000 shaft horsepower. To this day, the NK-12 remains the most powerful turboprop engine ever built. Each engine drove 2 sets of 4-bladed propellers, spinning in opposite directions, sometimes contra-rotating, with a diameter of 5.5 meters, 18 feet, taller than most living rooms. And those propellers were the source of the Tu-114's most famous quality. At cruise speed, the tips of those blades went supersonic. They broke the sound barrier with every revolution. Not once, continuously. The result was a sound unlike anything else in aviation. A deep, resonant, churning roar that rattled windows on the ground and shook the chests of pilots flying nearby. American F-15 pilots who intercepted the military Bear on Cold War patrol missions reported, and this has been confirmed multiple times, that they could hear its propeller beat from inside their own sealed, pressurized cockpits, through their flight helmets. That sound, that relentless, supersonic, bone-deep thrumming. It would become the Tu-114's most defining characteristic, its blessing and its curse. Tupolev kept nearly everything from the bomber. The swept wings, set at 35 degrees, coincidentally the same sweep angle as the Boeing 707. The colossal NK-12 engines, with their contra-rotating propellers. The tail assembly. The main landing gear, built to support a bomber loaded with nuclear weapons, and fuel for a mission to America and back. What he changed was the fuselage. The Tu-114's fuselage was relatively narrow, fine for a bomber crew, too small for rows of passenger seats. Tupolev designed an entirely new fuselage, significantly wider, fully pressurized for passenger comfort. This new body was mated to the bomber's wings, engines and tail. The bomber's mid-wing configuration was changed to a low-wing design on the Airliner, which meant the entire aircraft sat much higher off the ground on its landing gear. The nose gear had to be completely redesigned, a new strut 3 meters tall to provide clearance for those enormous propellers sweeping beneath the low-mounted wings. That 3-meter nose gear. That's what caused all the trouble with stairs at airports around the world for the next 15 years. And there was one detail that delighted aviation enthusiasts and unsettled everyone else in equal measure. The Tu-114 retained the Tu-95's glass nose. The transparent navigator's station that, on the bomber, had been the bombardier's position, the seat where a man looked down through crystal-clear panels and calculated the release geometry for nuclear weapons. On the airliner, it served as a navigation station. The navigator sat in the glass nose and watched the Earth pass below. Forests, oceans, mountains, cities. But visually from outside, you could see straight through the front of this passenger airplane to the man sitting inside. A ghostly reminder, always visible, of what this machine had been in its previous life. The first Tu-114 rolled out of plant number 156 in the summer of 1957. Maiden flight, November 15th, 1957, barely a month after Sputnik had shocked the world. By 1958, it was on display at the Brussels World Exhibition, where it won the Grand Prix. Then Paris, Le Bourget, Budapest, Tirana. Everywhere it went, the Tu-114 drew enormous crowds. People could not believe something this large, this fast, flew on propellers. The numbers were staggering. Length 54 meters, 177 feet. Wingspan 51 meters, wider than a Boeing 747, which wouldn't fly for another 12 years. Maximum speed 880 kilometers per hour, 550 miles per hour. Jet speed from propellers, range nearly 11,000 kilometers. It could fly from Moscow to New York, from Moscow to Havana, from Moscow to the far edge of Siberia. And Tupolev, ever the cautious engineer, had a backup plan. In deep secrecy, he'd also converted 2 actual Tu-95 bombers into emergency VIP transports, designated the Tu-116. Workers installed pressurized passenger compartments directly into the aircraft's bomb bays, the spaces where nuclear weapons were meant to ride. The main compartment, designed for what internal documents called the main passenger, meaning Khrushchev, was decorated like a Kremlin office. Sofas, fine furnishings, a separate section for the entourage, a buffet kitchen, a toilet, an office space. All of it inside a bomb bay, but Khrushchev refused to fly in it. He understood exactly how it would look. "American mass media will be waiting for me at my arrival," he said. The leader of the Soviet Union, stepping out of a nuclear bomber with curtains over the bomb bay windows. The Tu-116 was never used. One survives today at the Ulyanovsk Aircraft Museum, parked in the open air beside the last Tu-114. The weapon and its civilian descendant side by side in the Russian heartland. Now, let's step aboard. Imagine yourself at the base of that tall boarding staircase, the one that gave ground crews such headaches at every airport from Washington to Tokyo. You climb. The steps are steep. The aircraft's door is absurdly high off the ground. At the top, the fuselage opens before you, and you step into something that looks nothing like any airplane interior you've ever seen in photographs from America or Western Europe. Walk with me, nose to tail. Let me show you what 6 million passengers saw. Just behind the cockpit and the glass-nosed navigator's station, you enter the forward passenger cabin. 41 seats, arranged 3 and 3 across a central aisle, with the first row configured 2 and 3. The seats are standard for the era, not luxurious, but comfortable enough. The cabin is wide. The fuselage diameter is 3.3 meters, only 20% narrower than a Boeing 767, an aircraft that wouldn't exist for another 2 decades. Overhead, soft lighting. Underfoot, carpet. Through the oval windows, round-cornered, Soviet style, the ground is falling away, and the engines are settling into their cruise rhythm. The Tu-114 climbs with purpose, at a rate that surprises passengers who've only flown smaller turboprops. This airplane has ambitions beyond its propellers. Past the forward cabin, you reach a space that, on a Western aircraft, simply wouldn't exist. A wardrobe, a proper coat room, with hangers and hooks where passengers check their overcoats and fur hats, and the heavy layered clothing that Russian winters demand. It seems a small thing, but it tells you something about the philosophy of this aircraft. The designers thought about the entire journey, not just the hours in the seat, but the transition from the freezing tarmac at Vnukovo Airport in January to the pressurized warmth of the cabin. They provided a place for your coat. They acknowledged that you were a person with belongings, not a parcel to be shipped. And then you enter the restaurant. 8 tables, 6 seats at each, arranged face to face, 3 passengers on one side, 3 on the other, looking directly at each other across the table, exactly like a European dining car, exactly like the restaurant wagon on the Trans-Siberian Railway, or the Orient Express, or any of the great European sleeper trains. The tables have place settings. On official government flights, when the aircraft is carrying diplomats or VIPs, this section operates as a full-service restaurant. Meals served on china by white-jacketed cabin crew, multi-course dinners, crystal glassware catching the overhead light. On regular domestic flights, these are simply passenger seats, 48 of them, sold at the same price as every other seat on the airplane. No special treatment, no premium service. The tablecloth stays, but the fantasy of a flying restaurant gives way to the reality of Aeroflot in 1963. But here's what nobody warns you about. This section, this restaurant, with its set tables and its face-to-face seating and its aspirations to airborne elegance, sits directly between the inboard engines. And those engines, the NK-12AS, those 4 screaming Kuznetsov turboprops with their supersonic propeller tips, produce noise that, at this point in the cabin, reaches between 108 and 112 decibels. For perspective, 110 decibels is roughly equivalent to standing beside a chainsaw. It is at the threshold of physical pain. It is louder than the front row of an amplified rock concert. And it is sustained, unrelenting, for the entire duration of the flight. You are sitting at a properly laid table with tablecloth and cutlery and a napkin, face to face with a stranger, eating a meal prepared by a chef in a kitchen beneath your feet. And the world outside the fuselage walls is howling at a volume that makes sustained conversation somewhere between very difficult and completely impossible. There's a wonderful contradiction in this, a very Soviet contradiction. The designers went to extraordinary lengths to create an experience of civilized dining at altitude. Face-to-face seating, proper table service, a chef working in a kitchen below. And then they positioned the whole arrangement in the loudest section of what was already one of the loudest passenger aircraft ever built. Elegance and thunder, side by side. Ambition and brute force, neither willing to yield to the other. Tablecloth and sonic boom. Those restaurant seats, incidentally, were sold last. Everyone knew they were the worst seats on the plane. If you held a ticket for the restaurant section, it meant you'd booked late, or you'd drawn the short straw, or you simply hadn't the connections to get something better. The restaurant was the last section to fill, every flight. Past the restaurant, you reach a small service area with crew stations and equipment. And here, something remarkable, a staircase leading down. This is the threshold of the Tu-114’s hidden world. Most passengers walked past it, perhaps glancing down, perhaps noting the cabin crew disappearing below and reappearing with trays, but few were invited to descend. If you do, if you follow those stairs, you emerge onto the lower deck and you've entered a completely different aircraft. A full galley kitchen, not a warming station, not a trolley bay with microwave ovens, not the kind of galley you'd find on a Western airliner of the era. A kitchen with a chef, real cooking surfaces, preparation areas, storage for ingredients, pots on burners, the smell of soup, the smell of bread. The particular warm, greasy, onion-scented atmosphere of a working kitchen. At 25,000 feet, moving at 500 miles an hour. The food prepared here travels upward to the passenger cabin via a dumbwaiter, a small service elevator built into the structure of the aircraft, connecting the two decks. The chef loads a plate. The dumbwaiter ascends. A bell or a light signals the cabin crew above. The hatch opens in the cabin floor, and out comes dinner. Hot, freshly prepared, on a plate that passengers might reasonably assume originated from some less interesting source. Also on the lower deck, 2 cargo compartments for luggage and freight, and a crew rest lounge. Bunks and seating for the relief flight crew, because on the longest routes, the 18-hour Havana run, the 10.5-hour Tokyo crossing, a single flight crew cannot stay alert for the entire journey. They rotate. They rest below, in the belly of the airplane, sleeping while passengers sleep above them, while the chef cooks between them, while the engines roar around them all. This 2-deck arrangement was, in 1961, genuinely revolutionary. No other commercial aircraft in the world separated passengers and services this way. Passengers on the upper deck, galley and cargo and crew rest on the lower. The Boeing 747, which would make this layout famous, wouldn't fly until 1969. The Tu-114 did it 8 years earlier. Soviet engineers had arrived independently at the same architectural logic that would define every wide-body jet for the next half-century. If you put the living spaces above and the working spaces below, both function better. Now, back up the stairs, past the service area and the stairwell, and into the section that gives this documentary its name, the sleeping compartments. 4 of them arranged in a row along the fuselage. Each one is a small enclosed room, not a curtained-off berth, not a reclining seat, not a lie-flat business class pod of the sort that wouldn't be invented for decades. A room, with walls and a door or a heavy curtain. Inside each compartment, 2 lower berths arranged along the fuselage walls, and 1 upper berth folding down from above. A small folding table between the lower beds for a book, a glass of tea, a newspaper, individual reading lamps mounted on the wall, casting a warm, focused circle of light. Space for personal belongings, an intimacy that no other aircraft in the world offered. After 2 hours of flight, the cabin crew arrive with bedding, sheets, blankets, pillows, real linens like a hotel. The berths are made up. You undress, partially or fully, depending on your disposition and how many strangers share your compartment. Pull the curtain, switch on the reading lamp, and lie back. And here, something happens that is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. The vibration of the aircraft, that constant deep tremor, from the engines transmitted through the airframe, through the floor, through the walls, through everything, passes through the berth and into your body. It's not painful. It's not unpleasant exactly. It's steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like the pulse of a great machine doing the only thing it was built to do, like, and passengers said this again and again, like sleeping on a night train, the gentle rocking, the white noise, the sensation of being carried through darkness while the world passes unseen. Outside, that's the connection. That's why the Tu-114's sleeping compartments felt so natural to Soviet passengers. The Soviet Union was, above everything else, a nation of trains. Vast distances. Moscow to Vladivostok was over 9,000 kilometers. A journey of 6 or 7 days meant that millions of Soviet citizens knew intimately what it felt like to sleep in a couchette, lulled by the rhythm of wheels on rails. Bedding distributed by the provodnitsa, tea from the samovar, the particular comfort of a small enclosed space moving through an immense landscape. The Tu-114's sleeping compartments weren't inventing a new experience, they were translating a deeply familiar one into the sky. A couchette at 25,000 feet, a night train that flew. Khrushchev and his wife slept in these compartments during the flight to Washington. Their staff and entourage occupied the tourist cabins fore and aft. When the Premier of the Soviet Union descended that emergency ladder at Andrews Air Force Base, stiff perhaps from hours in a berth, blinking in the September sunlight, he had slept in a bed at 500 miles an hour, eaten meals prepared by a chef working a kitchen beneath his feet, inside an aircraft whose wings and engines had been designed to deliver nuclear weapons to American cities. The contradictions are breathtaking. And they are what make this aircraft unforgettable. Past the sleeping compartments, you reach the rear passenger cabin. 54 seats, 3 and 3. On international flights, this was first class, not for the beds it didn't have, but for its position in the aircraft. Set well aft of the propeller line, the rear cabin was the quietest section of the Tu-114. Quieter is a relative term, of course. It was still loud, still noisy enough that Western passengers used to jet travel found it startling. But compared to the midsection restaurant, it was a haven. And on the international routes, the sleeping compartments and the rear cabin together constituted the premium experience. Beds in one section, relative peace in the other. That's the aircraft. Nose to tail, glass bombardier's nose, cockpit, forward cabin, wardrobe, restaurant with face-to-face tables, service area and stairway to the lower deck, galley kitchen with a chef and a dumbwaiter, crew rest quarters, cargo holds, back upstairs to sleeping compartments with beds and blankets and reading lamps, rear cabin, 170 passengers, a 5 or 6 person flight crew, 10 cabin attendants, a chef, all of them enclosed in a pressurized tube derived from a nuclear bomber, moving across the surface of the Earth at 500 miles an hour. The propeller tips shattering the sound barrier 60 times per second. Nothing like it had ever existed before. Nothing like it has existed since. Let's say it's 1964. You're a mid-ranking Soviet trade official, posted to the embassy in New Delhi. You've been recalled to Moscow for annual consultations. Your ticket is for the Aeroflot service, departing Delhi on a Tuesday afternoon. The aircraft assigned a Tupolev Tu-114. You arrive at the airport in the heavy Delhi heat. The airplane is visible from the terminal. It's always visible because it towers over everything else on the apron. The nose gear, 3 meters tall, gives the aircraft the posture of a wading bird, its body held absurdly high above the tarmac. The propellers, even stationary, look impossibly large, each blade nearly 3 meters long, drooping slightly under their own weight. From a distance, it looks less like a passenger airplane and more like something from a newsreel about the future. The swept wings, the glass nose, the sheer vertical scale of the thing. Boarding is an event. At Delhi, as at most airports outside Moscow, the ground crews have had to improvise with the stairs. Standard equipment doesn't reach. Something has been arranged. A taller set of steps, perhaps borrowed from a maintenance hangar, or a mobile platform brought in for the occasion. You climb. The steps feel steeper than any boarding stairs you've used before, the angle sharper, the height dizzying. Halfway up, you glance down at the tarmac receding below, and the massive main landing gear behind you, and you think this is a very large airplane. And then you're inside. The cabin crew greet you. 10 of them on this international route, a generous compliment by any standard. They take your coat and hat for the wardrobe. You're directed to your seat. If you've been fortunate, and or well-connected, or both, you have one of the sleeping berths. If not, you're in the forward or rear cabin in a standard seat, which is perfectly adequate. The seat you hope you haven't drawn is in the restaurant section, amidships, between the engines. But we'll get to that. The doors close, the engines start. One by one, 4 Kuznetsov NK, 12 turboprops spool up. The sound builds, not the rising whine of a jet, but something thicker, heavier, a growl that deepens as each engine joins the chorus. The contra-rotating propellers begin to turn, slowly at first, the individual blades visible, then faster, blurring, their rhythms synchronizing across the wing. The sound fills the cabin, not as background, as presence. Takeoff. The four engines at full power produce a combined 60,000 shaft horsepower, an almost incomprehensible amount of thrust from propellers. The Tu-114 accelerates down the Delhi runway with a determination that belies its 91-ton empty weight. The nose lifts. The main gear leave the ground. And as you climb, the altimeter unwinding, the engines settling into their climb power setting, the landscape of northern India spreads below, gold and green in the late afternoon light, the Ganges winding silver toward the horizon. The noise? It's there. Of course it's there. It was there from the moment the engine started, and it will be there until the moment they stop, hours from now in Moscow. Veterans of the Tu-114 speak of the noise the way sailors speak of the sea. Not with surprise, not always with complaint, but with the resigned familiarity of people who have made their peace with something immutable. You don't fight the noise on a Tu-114, you accommodate it. You learn quickly to lean closer when speaking. You learn to read lips a little. You raise your voice without thinking about it. In the midsection, near the engines, some passengers give up on conversation altogether and communicate by writing notes on whatever paper is available. But there are quieter zones, in relatively speaking, always relatively speaking. The sleeping compartments, set well aft of the propeller line, are noticeably calmer, still loud by Western standards, still loud enough that you wouldn't mistake it for a jet, but softened. The roar becomes a rumble, constant and deep, and, for reasons that have more to do with psychology than acoustics, almost soothing. The rear cabin, too, is more livable. A former passenger recalled years later that it was noisier than a jet, but quieter than a Vickers Vanguard, a precise, rather British comparison, but useful. It places the Tu-114's rear cabin in a category that's unpleasant but endurable. An hour into the flight, the cabin crew begin meal service. And here is where the Tu-114 reveals its most charming secret. The food is not reheated. It hasn't been loaded onto the aircraft in foil-covered trays and zapped in an oven. It has been prepared, cooked, seasoned, plated in the galley kitchen on the lower deck by a chef who has been working since before takeoff. You may hear faintly the hum of the dumbwaiter beneath the cabin floor. The crew opens the hatch. Plates appear, steaming, fragrant, real. On international routes, the meal service is genuinely impressive. Multiple courses, Soviet specialties, soups, fish, meats in rich sauces, dark bread, compote for dessert. Served on proper china with metal cutlery that has actual weight in your hand. Nothing disposable, nothing plastic. The cabin crew move through the aircraft with professional efficiency, distributing meals, pouring drinks, managing the logistics of feeding 170 people from a kitchen you can't see. For passengers in the restaurant section, meals are served at the face-to-face tables. There is something inherently social about eating across a table from a stranger, looking into someone's eyes while you share a meal, even if conversation is conducted at a near shout. You gesture, you nod, you smile, you point at a dish you'd like passed. It's intimate in a way that rows of forward-facing seats can never be. It's also, with the engine screaming just outside the fuselage wall, faintly surreal. The hours pass. Through the windows, the world changes beneath you. India gives way to the vastness of Central Asia, desert, steppe. The occasional village visible as a cluster of specks beside a road that leads nowhere you can see. Mountain ranges appear and fall behind. Rivers wind silver and brown through land that stretches, flat and enormous, to every horizon. The sun moves, shadows lengthen across the cabin. If you're in a sleeping compartment, the evening rituals begin as the light outside fades. The cabin crew arrive with your bedding, sheets, a blanket, a pillow. The berth is made up with practiced hands. You pull the curtain. The reading lamp casts its small, warm circle of light. Enough to read by, not enough to disturb anyone else in the compartment. Through the thin wall, muffled but persistent, the engines maintain their vigil. The vibration comes up through the berth, through the mattress, through the frame of the bed, into your bones. It's steady, dependable, unchanging. You read for a while, or you don't. You listen to the engines, that deep, rhythmic pulse that, after an hour, the brain stops registering as noise and begins processing as something else. White noise, ocean waves, a heartbeat, the sound of being carried. You sleep, thousands of meters above the earth, in a machine born from a nuclear bomber, wrapped in Soviet-made blankets, rocked by the vibration of 15,000 horsepower per engine. You sleep. And it feels more than anything like riding a night train across Siberia, the couchette rocking gently, the landscape invisible outside, the provodnitsa somewhere down the corridor, the samovar heating water for morning tea. Hours later, how many depends on the route. Moscow to Khabarovsk is 8. Moscow to Havana can reach 18. The descent begins. The engine note changes. The pitch shifts. Not quieter, but different, lower, less urgent. The aircraft settles into its approach. Through the windows, if it's dawn, Russia emerges from the dark. Forests first, then rivers, then the grey sprawl of Moscow spreading to the horizon, smoking from 1,000 chimneys in the cold morning air, landing. The long rollout, the engines howling in reverse thrust, the taxi to the gate, the propellers winding down, their blur resolving once more into individual blades. And then, something remarkable in itself. Silence, or what passes for silence after hours inside a Tu-114. Your ears ring. The world feels padded, muffled, as if someone has stuffed cotton into reality. You gather your things. You collect your coat from the wardrobe. You join the queue for the door, and you descend, carefully, because the stairs are always steep and always too short, into the Moscow air. Cold, probably, whatever month it is. Behind you, the Tu-114 sits enormous and still on the tarmac. The propellers droop. The glass nose stares forward at nothing. The chef has turned off his ovens. The dumbwaiter is quiet. The sleeping compartments are empty, the sheets stripped, ready to be laundered and replaced before the next departure. It was never a quiet journey. It was never a gentle one. But it was, in its peculiar, thunderous, bed-equipped way, unlike anything else in the sky. The Tu-114 was built for distance. That was its purpose, its reason for existing. An airliner that could cross oceans and continents without stopping. Its range, nearly 11,000 kilometers, meant it could reach places no other Soviet aircraft could touch. And in the early 1960s, the Soviet Union needed to reach one place above all others. Cuba. The story of the Moscow to Havana route is one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of commercial aviation. Not for its luxury or its comfort, though the Tu-114 offered both after a fashion, but for its sheer improbability. An 18-hour turboprop flight over the Arctic and the Atlantic, shaped by geopolitical chess moves that determined not just the schedule, but the very path the airplane could fly. Flights to Cuba began on July 10, 1962, initially routing through Conakry, the capital of Guinea in West Africa. The Tu-114 would fly from Moscow to Conakry, refuel, and continue across the South Atlantic to Havana. It was a workable route. It was not destined to last. The United States was determined to isolate Fidel Castro's Cuba, and one lever of that isolation was diplomatic pressure on the nations that provided Aeroflot with refueling stops. American diplomats leaned on Guinea, and after just 4 flights, Conakry denied the Soviets landing rights. Aeroflot rerouted through Dakar in Senegal. 3 flights later, Senegal closed its doors under the same pressure. Then Algeria Aeroflot tried Algiers, and 3 flights later, that stop, too, was denied. Each time the Americans squeezed. Each time a refueling point vanished from the map. The Soviet response was blunt, pragmatic, and characteristically audacious. If the world wouldn't let them stop, they wouldn't stop. Engineers at Tupolev created a special long-range variant, the Tu-114’s. The modification was radical. 60% of the passenger seating was ripped out and replaced with 15 additional fuel tanks. Capacity plummeted from 170 passengers to somewhere between 52 and 60. The aircraft's takeoff weight increased to 182,000 kilograms, pushing the very limits of what the airframe and engines could safely handle. The new route began from Murmansk, above the Arctic Circle. Not Moscow, Murmansk, hundreds of kilometers north, chosen because it shortened the overwater distance. From Murmansk, the Tu-114’s flew northwest over the Norwegian Sea, past Iceland, down through the North Atlantic, and south along the length of the Western Hemisphere to Havana. Over neutral waters the entire way, no overflight of any Western nation required, no landing rights needed, just ocean for thousands of miles, and then Cuba. A CIA intelligence memo dated January 28, 1963, described the route with characteristic precision. The total distance from Moscow to Havana via Murmansk, more than 6,500 miles. Flying time, approximately 16 hours southbound, 14 hours northbound with favorable winds. The memo noted it was the world's longest regular non-stop air service, and it was brutal. Up to 18 hours in a turboprop with cabin noise exceeding 108 decibels. Over the open Arctic and Atlantic, thousands of miles from any diversion airport. Headwinds from the jet stream could reach nearly 200 miles an hour, adding hours to an already marathon crossing. 2 complete flight crews rotated on every flight. 50-odd passengers sat in what remained of the cabin, surrounded by fuel tanks where seats had been. Think about that for a moment. 18 hours in a converted nuclear bomber over open ocean. In the early 1960s, when transatlantic navigation was still partly accomplished by dead reckoning and star sighting, with 50 passengers, 15 extra fuel tanks, and enough kerosene to cross the Atlantic and then some. Whatever your thoughts on the politics, the aviation is extraordinary. But the Tu-114's most improbable route wasn't born from Cold War rivalry. It was born from Cold War cooperation. In April 1967, Japan Airlines and Aeroflot inaugurated a joint service between Tokyo and Moscow, operated by Tu-114 aircraft. The backstory is almost as remarkable as the service itself. The idea was first proposed in 1956. Negotiations took an entire decade. The obstacles were immense, not technical, but political and psychological. Japan and the Soviet Union had been enemies. The USSR had invaded Manchuria in the final days of the Second World War, interned hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, and the two nations had never signed a formal peace treaty. Their political systems stood at opposite ends of every spectrum, but geography made the argument that politics couldn't. The shortest air route between Japan and Europe runs directly through Russian airspace. Without Soviet overflight rights, airlines flying between Tokyo and European capitals had to route through Anchorage, Alaska, and across the Arctic, adding 2,500 kilometers and several hours to every flight. A direct route through Soviet airspace changed everything. An agreement was signed in January 1966. The conditions were extraordinary, reflecting the mutual suspicion and mutual need that defined the arrangement. 4 Tu-114’s were specially reconfigured with a 2-class layout seating 105 passengers. The sleeping compartments and restaurant section retained, the economy cabins adjusted. The aircraft livery was modified, standard Aeroflot colors, but with a small Japan Airlines crane logo and JAL lettering added to the forward fuselage. 2 flags on one airplane, 2 ideologies inside one cabin. The first flight departed April 17, 1967, Moscow to Tokyo, 10 hours and 35 minutes. Tokyo to Moscow, 11 hours and 25 minutes, the difference due to prevailing winds. On board, 5 Aeroflot cabin crew and 5 from Japan Airlines worked side by side, an arrangement that must have required delicate choreography and considerable goodwill. One JAL pilot sat in the cockpit alongside the Aeroflot flight crew, monitoring instruments following the route. Passengers received what all accounts describe as excellent service, a blend of Russian and Japanese hospitality that no one had experienced before and no one has experienced since. Russian dishes and Japanese dishes, Aeroflot procedures and JAL standards. Two cultures meeting literally in the aisle? The only consistent complaint across every account was the noise. The partnership lasted 2 years. By 1969, the Ilyushin Haile L-62 was available for the route, and the 4 dedicated Tu-114’s were converted back to standard domestic configuration. But for those 2 years in the middle of the Cold War, a Soviet bomber-turned-airliner wearing a Japanese Airlines logo flew regularly between Moscow and Tokyo, crewed by citizens of 2 nations that were technically still at war. The route passed over some of the most sensitive military installations in the Soviet Union. Soviet authorities had worried about secrecy. Japanese authorities had worried about safety. And yet, it worked. There's something quietly wonderful about that. A detail that reminds you that even in the most rigid of eras, the human impulse to connect, to trade, to cross the distances between us finds a way. Beyond Cuba and Tokyo, the Tu-114 served routes that read like a Cold War atlas. Copenhagen, Paris, New Delhi, Belgrade, Montreal. Wherever the Soviet Union needed to project prestige or maintain connections with allies and partners, the Tu-114 went. And at each new destination, the same small comedy repeated itself. Ground crews staring up at the cabin door, realizing their stairs were several feet too short. London, Paris, Schiphol, the same problem at every airport that wasn't Moscow. The Tu-114 was an aircraft built to Soviet dimensions, for Soviet infrastructure, and the rest of the world's airports simply had to improvise. Maintenance crews scrambled, makeshift platforms were assembled. At some stops, the aircraft carried its own portable stairs in the cargo hold, just in case. It's a small thing, the height of a door, but it tells you something about this airplane. The Tu-114 didn't accommodate the world. The world had to accommodate the Tu-114. And for 15 years somehow, it did. We've walked through the passenger cabins. We've sat in the sleeping compartments, dined in the restaurant, endured the noise. We've seen what 6 million passengers saw across 15 years of service. But there was another world aboard the Tu-114, a hidden one. Below the cabin floor, beneath the sleeping berths and the face-to-face dining tables and the rows of standard seats, a different kind of life was being lived. A world the passengers above rarely glimpsed and almost never entered. The lower deck. To reach it, you descend the internal staircase near the midsection of the aircraft, the one beside row 16, where 3 seats were equipped with baby bassinets. A thoughtful touch on an aircraft that flew families across the breadth of the Soviet Union. The stairs are narrow, functional, not decorative. They were designed for cabin crew, moving quickly between decks, not for sightseeing passengers. The handrail vibrates beneath your grip. The engine noise, paradoxically, seems different down here. Not louder, exactly, but closer, more intimate, as if you can feel the machinery working just beyond the fuselage skin. At the bottom, you step into the galley kitchen. And galley is a word that does this space no justice at all. This is a working kitchen, not a warming station, not a trolley bay where pre-packaged meals are loaded into ovens and distributed. A kitchen. There are cooking surfaces, real burners, producing real heat. Preparation areas where ingredients are chopped, arranged, composed into dishes. Storage compartments designed to withstand turbulence, keeping provisions secure, while the aircraft bucks through weather systems at 25,000 feet. There are pots, there are pans, there are the tools of a cook's trade, all of them secured against the constant vibration of 4 engines and the occasional lurch of clear air turbulence over Central Asia. And there is a chef, an actual cook, not a flight attendant who happens to heat food, but a member of the crew whose sole responsibility is to prepare meals in this kitchen at altitude at 500 miles an hour for up to 170 passengers. The smell of this space is its own world. Soup, always soup, on Soviet flights, because soup is the foundation of the Russian meal. Onions softening in butter, meat braising slowly, bread, if not baked aboard, at least warmed to the point where it releases its yeasty, wheaty fragrance into the confined lower deck air. The particular steam of a kitchen in full operation, hot, slightly greasy, rich with the accumulation of every dish that has been and is being prepared. This kitchen exists below the passengers' feet. The diners in the restaurant section, the sleepers in their berths, the standard class passengers reading Pravda or staring out the window at the step. None of them see this space. They experience its output. The dumbwaiter hums, rises through the cabin floor, opens at the service station above, and delivers plates of food that appear to the passengers with the quiet efficiency of a well-run hotel. The machinery of hospitality invisible by design. The dumbwaiter itself is worth a moment's attention. It's a small service elevator, essentially a mechanical lift connecting the 2 decks, large enough to carry several plates at once, operated by the crew below or summoned from above. It moves through a shaft, built into the aircraft's structure, a vertical corridor between the world where food is made and the world where food is consumed. On every flight, it makes dozens of trips, up with full plates, down with empty ones, up with the next course, down with the debris of the last. A tiny, tireless machine inside a much larger one. Beside the kitchen, further aft on the lower deck, the crew rest quarters. On the short domestic routes, Moscow to Novosibirsk, say, 4 or 5 hours, the relief crew space might go unused. But on the marathon flights, the 18-hour Havana crossing, the 10.5-hour Tokyo run, this space becomes essential. The Tu-114 carried a flight crew of 5 or 6, 2 pilots, a navigator, 2 flight engineers, sometimes a radio operator. On the longest routes, 2 complete crews were aboard, rotating. While one crew flew, the other rested in these bunks below the passenger deck. The bunks are functional, not comfortable in any luxurious sense. Small, enclosed, fitted into the available space between structural frames, but adequate. You lie down. The vibration of the engines comes through the walls, through the mattress, into your body. The same vibration the passengers feel in their sleeping compartments above. But here, in the belly of the aircraft, it's more pronounced, more raw, less filtered. You sleep anyway because you have to, because in 4 hours you'll be back in the cockpit, hands-on controls that require genuine physical effort, navigating by star sight and radio beacon over the North Atlantic in the middle of the night. And further aft still, 2 cargo compartments. Luggage, freight, mail. The Tu-114 carried it all, in holds that occupied the remainder of the lower deck. On the Cuba route, some of this cargo space was sacrificed for the additional fuel tanks that made the non-stop crossing possible. On standard flights, it held the accumulated belongings of 170 passengers, suitcases, boxes, the small personal cargoes of people travelling enormous distances across the largest country on Earth. This lower deck is the Tu-114's secret architecture, the engine room of the passenger experience. Above, passengers dined and slept and complained about the noise. Below, a chef cooked, a dumbwaiter shuttled meals, relief crews slept between shifts, and cargo sat secured against turbulence. The two worlds, the visible and the invisible, existed simultaneously, separated by a floor and a staircase, and the social convention that passengers stay above, and the work of keeping them comfortable happens below. It was, as we've noted, a layout that anticipated the future. Every wide-body jet flying today uses this same basic arrangement. Passengers on the upper deck, cargo and services on the lower, connected by systems that keep the visible world functioning. The Boeing 747, the Airbus A380, the 777, the 787, all of them owe a structural debt to this principle. The Tu-114 didn't invent it consciously, perhaps. Soviet engineers were solving a practical problem. A wider fuselage created space below the cabin floor, and that space needed a purpose. But the solution they found would become the standard for half a century of aviation. Now, let's go the other way. Not down to the lower deck, but forward. All the way forward, past the cockpit to the very nose of the aircraft. The navigator sat here, in a glass-enclosed station inherited directly from the Tu-114 bomber, where a bombardier had once peered down through transparent panels, calculating the release geometry for weapons that could destroy cities. The glass nose of the Tu-114 was, in its civilian life, a navigation station. The navigator occupied a seat, surrounded by windows. Above, below, to the sides, the Earth was visible in every direction. On a clear day, the curvature of the horizon was apparent. At night, stars filled the glass enclosure from edge to edge. On the long overwater routes, the Cuba Run, the transatlantic crossings, the North Pacific passage to Tokyo, the navigator's role was critical. Ground-based navigation aids were sparse over the Arctic and the Atlantic in the early 1960s. Inertial navigation systems were primitive or absent. The navigator worked with charts, with star sights, with radio bearings where available, with dead reckoning where not. He plotted the aircraft's position. He calculated wind drift. He told the pilots where they were and where they needed to go. And he did all of this while sitting in a glass bubble at the front of a passenger airplane, moving at 500 miles an hour, with the world rushing toward him in a way that must have been, on clear days, both magnificent and mildly terrifying. Behind the navigator in the cockpit proper, the pilots worked with controls that belonged to an earlier age of aviation. The Tu-114 had no fly-by-wire system. That technology lay decades in the future. Control inputs were mechanical, transmitted through cables and linkages to the flight surfaces. And on an aircraft this size, with wings this large moving through the air at Mach 0.71, the forces involved were considerable. Pilots were known to say they should eat well before a flight, not as humour, but as practical advice. Wrestling the Tu-114 through hours of flight was physical work. Two flight engineers sat behind the pilots, monitoring banks of instruments and gauges, 4 engines, 32 propeller blades, fuel flow, oil pressure, exhaust temperature, propeller pitch, dozens of parameters, each one requiring attention, each one capable of indicating a problem that could develop on a Havana crossing into a crisis with no airport within 1,000 miles. These men, and in that era, in Soviet aviation, they were exclusively men, flew the Tu-114 for up to 18 hours at a stretch. They navigated by stars over the Arctic. They monitored engines that produced supersonic shock waves with every propeller revolution. They did this in an aircraft that shook and howled and demanded physical strength to control. And in 15 years of service, carrying over 6 million passengers, there was exactly one fatal accident. Aeroflot Flight 065 on February 17, 1966. A nighttime takeoff from Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow when the aircraft struck a snowbank that had not been properly cleared from the edge of the runway. The propellers of the number 3 and 4 engines hit the ground. The aircraft veered off course and caught fire. It was not a failure of the aircraft. It was not a failure of the crew. It was a snow bank and inadequate ground maintenance on a winter night in Moscow. One accident, 6 million passengers. In a converted nuclear bomber flying the longest routes in the world through Arctic storms and Atlantic jet streams, the record speaks for itself. We've explored the Tu-114 at its most remarkable. The sleeping compartments, the restaurant, the chef's kitchen, the glass nose. But most passengers, on most flights, experienced none of those things. Most passengers sat in standard seats and watched the hours pass. And in those standard seats, the Tu-114 revealed something interesting. Not about aviation, but about the society that built it. On domestic flights within the Soviet Union, there were no classes. This was official Aeroflot policy, rooted in official Soviet ideology. Every seat on a Tu-114, whether in the forward cabin, the rear cabin or the restaurant section, was sold at the same price. There was no first class, no business class, no hierarchy of comfort for those willing to pay more. A professor from Moscow State University sat in the same type of seat as a collective farm manager from Khabarovsk. A general's wife occupied the same space as a factory foreman. The sleeping compartments, the tablecloth-covered restaurant, the standard class rows, all sold at one fare, in theory. In practice, of course, the aircraft had a perfectly obvious hierarchy, and everyone who flew regularly understood it. The sleeping compartments, those couchette-style berths with sheets and blankets and reading lamps, were the most desirable space on the airplane. They were quieter than the midsection. They offered privacy. They offered sleep. Getting a berth required either booking early, knowing the right people, or being the kind of passenger whose needs the system prioritized. The rear cabin was the next best thing. Set behind the propeller line, it was the quietest section of the aircraft. Then the forward cabin, moderately loud but bearable. And at the bottom of every unspoken ranking, the restaurant section. Those 48 seats, arranged face to face at their elegant tables in the loudest part of the aircraft. Between the inner engines, at 110 decibels, the restaurant seats were sold last, always last. If you held a ticket for the restaurant section, it meant one of several things. You'd booked late, you had no connections, or you simply didn't know enough to avoid it. The restaurant was, in practical terms, the cheapest seat on the airplane. Not in price, which was identical to every other seat, but in desirability. It was steerage in a classless society. A classless airplane with a perfectly visible hierarchy. Sleeping compartments as the penthouse. The howling restaurant as the basement. And nobody acknowledged the distinction publicly, because officially in the Soviet Union of the 1960s, such distinctions did not exist. On international flights, the pretense dropped entirely. The sleeping compartments were marketed as first class, priced accordingly. The tourist cabins offered standard service at a lower fare. The system made perfect sense to anyone accustomed to class-differentiated travel. It was the domestic fiction, identical prices for dramatically different experiences, that was peculiar. But set the politics aside for a moment. Because the Tu-114, even in its economy seats, offered something worth noting. Space. The cabin was wide for its era, 3 seats on each side of the aisle, with room to move, room to breathe, room to shift in your seat without bumping your neighbor's elbow. The fuselage was wider than a Boeing 707's, wider than a DC-8's. Not wide body, but generous. You weren't cramped. You weren't sardined into a metal tube with your knees against the seat in front. And every passenger, regardless of where they sat, had access to the same food. The chef's kitchen produced meals for the entire aircraft, not just the premium sections. standard class passengers ate the same food, prepared below, elevated by dumbwaiter, distributed by the same cabin crew, as the passengers in the sleeping compartments. The quality of the meal didn't change with the quality of the seat. Every passenger also shared the noise. This is worth emphasizing. On a Western airline, first-class passengers bought, among other things, a quieter cabin. Forward of the engines, insulated, carpeted, hushed. On the Tu-114, nobody escaped the sound. The sleeping compartments were quieter than the restaurant section, yes, but they were still loud. 100 decibels, perhaps, versus 112. The difference between very loud and extremely loud. Wealth didn't silence the propellers. Rank didn't dampen the vibration. The noise was the great equalizer. There's something democratic about that. Perhaps not in the way Soviet ideology intended, but real and felt and shared by every soul aboard. We've circled around this subject through every chapter. We've mentioned it as a fact, acknowledged it as a feature, described it in decibels, but the noise of the Tu-114 deserves its own moment in this story. Because it was not merely a characteristic of the aircraft, it was the aircraft's personality, its voice, its most unforgettable quality, the thing passengers remember decades later, when the beds and the food and the routes had faded into general memory, but the sound remained vivid and specific, like a song you heard once and can never quite forget. 108 to 112 decibels. Those are the documented figures. Let's make them real. At 110 decibels, you are at the threshold of pain. Sustained exposure causes permanent hearing damage. In any modern regulatory environment, workers exposed to that level would be required to wear ear protection, heavy-duty earmuffs, not simple foam plugs. On the Tu-114, this level was sustained for hours. 8 hours on the domestic run to Khabarovsk, 10.5 hours to Tokyo, 18 hours to Havana. There were no earplugs issued. There was no noise-cancelling technology. There were no announcements about hearing protection. There was the roar, and there was your ability to endure it. And between those two facts, there was nothing. The source was specific and inescapable. The Kuznetsov NK-12 engines drove contra-rotating propellers whose blade tips, at cruise speed, exceeded the speed of sound, not occasionally, not in certain conditions, continuously. Every revolution produced a supersonic crack from each blade tip, a shock wave, a miniature sonic boom that repeated dozens of times per second. Multiply this by 4 engines, 8 propeller discs, 32 blades, and you had a wall of sound that penetrated the fuselage despite whatever insulation Soviet engineers packed into the cabin walls. The Tu-95 bomber, from which the Tu-114 was derived, was legendary for its noise. NATO reconnaissance pilots who shadowed the Bear reported it as one of the loudest aircraft in military service. The distinctive sound, that deep, grinding, almost malevolent roar, was recognizable from miles away. F-15 pilots confirmed, again and again, that they could hear the Bear's propeller beat from inside their own pressurized cockpits through their flight helmets. The sound penetrated everything. The civilian Tu-114 inherited this quality, somewhat tamed by the wider, better insulated fuselage, but far from conquered. The noise was worst in the midsection, the restaurant section, with its set tables and face-to-face seating, which sat squarely between the 2 inboard engines. Passengers at those tables experienced the full, unmediated fury. Conversation was conducted at a shout, or not at all. Notes were written on paper napkins and passed across the elegant tablecloths. Gestures substituted for words. You pointed at what you wanted from the menu. You nodded thanks. You ate in a cocoon of sound so dense it felt almost physical, not just heard, but felt. A pressure against the chest, a vibration in the teeth. In the forward cabin, the noise was somewhat less, You were ahead of the engines, receiving their sound reflected and attenuated rather than direct. In the rear cabin, behind the propeller line, things improved further. The sleeping compartments occupied the quietest zone of the aircraft. Still loud, still unacceptable by any modern standard, but reduced to a level that, with sufficient fatigue and the right frame of mind, allowed sleep. And yet, here's the thing that surprises people who have only read about the Tu-114 in specifications and technical histories and never spoken to anyone who flew on it. The noise, for many passengers, became something other than a torment. Over time, over the course of an 8-hour flight, or a 10-hour flight, or an 18-hour flight, it transformed. It stopped being noise, in the aggressive sense of the word, and became a presence, a companion, part of the landscape of the journey, as much as the view through the window or the taste of the food. On the overnight flights, Moscow to Khabarovsk, Moscow to Havana, when the cabin lights dimmed and the sleeping compartments were made up, and passengers settled into their berths and pulled their curtains closed and switched off their reading lamps, the roar outside took on a different character. It softened, not in volume, which remained undiminished, but in perception. The brain, performing its ancient trick of adaptation, stopped treating the sound as a threat or an annoyance, and began processing it as background, as white noise, as the acoustic texture of the environment. And in that transformation, something remarkable happened. The noise became, for some passengers, almost soothing. Not quiet, never quiet, but rhythmic, constant, utterly unchanging, like the sound of a waterfall heard from a distance, like waves against a hull, and Soviet passengers reached for this comparison again and again, like the rhythm of a train on rails. That steady, dependable clatter that, after a while, the mind stops registering as noise and begins treating as silence. The sound of travel itself, the sound of being carried. Passengers who slept in the Tu-114's berths spoke of this for years afterward. The vibration through the mattress, not jarring but rhythmic, like a rocking motion that you felt rather than saw. The white noise of the engines wrapping around you like a blanket. The sensation of being enclosed, cocooned, borne along by something powerful and relentless, and entirely beyond your control. It was, they said, remarkably similar to sleeping on a night train. And for Soviet passengers, raised in a country where the great rail journeys were part of the national experience, the Trans-Siberian, the Moscow to Leningrad overnight, the week-long crossings from the capital to the Far East, this was not an unfamiliar sensation. It was almost comforting. There is a poet's truth in this, if not an engineer's. The Tu-114 was loud enough to damage hearing. It was built from a bomber that NATO considered one of the noisiest aircraft in military service. Its propeller tips broke the sound barrier with every rotation, and yet, in the dark, in the berths, wrapped in blankets, with the reading lamp off and the curtain drawn, and the engines maintaining their unbroken vigil through the hours between midnight and dawn, it could feel, gently, strangely, improbably like a lullaby. That is the paradox at the heart of the Tu-114 experience. The noise was a flaw. It was also, in certain conditions, a feature. It was the worst thing about flying this airplane. And it was, for some passengers on some flights, what allowed them to sleep at 500 miles an hour, 25,000 feet above the earth, inside a machine that never stopped reminding them it was there. The end came gradually, not with a single event, not with a dramatic final flight, but with a slow, steady replacement, the way one season yields to the next, imperceptibly at first, and then all at once. The Ilyushin IL-62, a sleek, 4-engine jet with rear-mounted engines and a T-tail, modern in every respect that the Tu-114 was not, entered Aeroflot service on September 15, 1967, with an inaugural flight from Moscow to Montreal. It was quieter, it was faster in cruise, it was smooth, without the constant vibration that defined every moment aboard the Tu-114. And it was, in the language of Cold War prestige, a jet, the technology of the future, the same propulsion that powered the Western airlines against which Aeroflot measured itself. The Tu-114 was suddenly yesterday's airplane. Route by route, the Il-62 displaced it. Delhi and Montreal fell first in 1967, the intercontinental prestige routes, where the Tu-114's noise and turboprop technology had become a competitive embarrassment against the Boeing 707s and DC-8s of the Western airlines sharing those routes. The Tokyo service, that remarkable Aeroflot-JL partnership, ended in 1969. The 4 dedicated aircraft converted back to domestic configuration, and the Japanese airline moving on to jet equipment. Havana followed, probably sometime in 1969. The Tu-114's were transferred to Domodedovo Airport, Moscow's second international hub, and reassigned to long domestic routes, the runs across the breadth of the Soviet Union that had always been their bread and butter. Moscow to Khabarovsk, Moscow to Alma-Ata, Moscow to Tashkent, Moscow to Novosibirsk, the great international showcase flights, the prestige routes, the Cold War propaganda missions, those belong to the IL-62 now. The Tu-114 became, in its final years, a domestic workhorse, still enormous, still fast, still loud, but no longer special. And then came the change that, more than the route transfers or the Il-62's arrival, marked the true end of the Tu-114 as something extraordinary. In the early 1970s, Aeroflot began stripping the sleeping compartments. One by one, across the fleet, the berths were removed. The lower bunks, the upper bunks, the folding tables, the reading lamps, all pulled out. The curtains came down. The walls of the compartments were dismantled. In their place, standard passenger seats, arranged in standard rows, 6 seats where 3 berths had been. The restaurant section suffered the same fate. The face-to-face tables, the tablecloth service, the dining car arrangement that gave the midsection its character, all replaced with ordinary forward-facing seats. The restaurant became just another cabin, louder than the rest, but no longer distinctive. 170 passengers became 200. The flying sleeper train became just another airplane. It's difficult not to feel something at that. The sleeping compartments were what made the Tu-114 remarkable. They were the detail that defied expectation. Beds at altitude, inside an aircraft derived from a nuclear bomber. Blankets and reading lamps in a machine with supersonic propeller tips. When they were removed, the Tu-114 lost the feature that made it unique. It became a large, loud, aging turboprop, increasingly outclassed by the jets that were replacing it on every route that mattered. With the beds and the restaurant, it had been a story. Without them, it was just a number. Why were they removed? The simplest answer is demand. Soviet air passenger numbers were growing rapidly through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Every seat counted. The sleeping compartments, with their 3 berths per room, occupied space that could hold 6 standard seats. The restaurant section was equally inefficient. Those face-to-face tables used floor area that, in a standard layout, could accommodate twice as many passengers. The airline needed capacity. The beds and the tablecloths were sacrificed to economics. By the early 1970s, only 3 or 4 Tu-114's retained their original sleeping and restaurant configuration. The rest had been gutted and rebuilt for maximum density. The airframe itself had limits. Soviet engineers had set the fatigue life of the Tu-114 at 14,000 flying hours. That sounds like a great deal of time, and it is. But the Tu-114 flew long routes. 8 hours to Khabarovsk, 10 to Tokyo, 18 to Havana. The hours accumulated faster than they would on a short-haul aircraft. Through the mid-1970s, one after another, the remaining Tu-114's reached their fatigue limit, The metal was tired. The wings, borrowed from a bomber whose design dated to the early 1950s, had been loaded and unloaded, pressurized and depressurized, heated and cooled through thousands of cycles over a decade and a half of service. They had carried passengers and cargo and diplomatic missions and sleeping dignitaries and working chefs across millions of kilometers of air. They had done enough. The last regular Tu-114 flights took place in 1976. 15 years of commercial service, over 6 million passengers carried. And then, in the summer of 1977, Aeroflot made a decision. 21 Tu-114’s and 14’s, the bulk of the surviving fleet, were scrapped simultaneously, cut apart, broken down, melted for their aluminum. Imagine that. 21 of these giants, these record holders, these sleeping palaces of the sky, reduced to raw material in a single season. 21 aircraft that had crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific, and the Siberian taiga and the Arctic ice, turned into metal ingots. Of the 32 Tu-114’s built, 21 disappeared that summer. The rest had been lost to various fates. One, the second pre-production aircraft, CCCP 76459, had set 19 world speed records in 1960, becoming the fastest propeller-driven aircraft in history. It was put on display at Novgorod Airport in 1977. In 1990, it was destroyed by fire. The world record holder gone. But 3 survived. 3 Tu-114’s exist today, silent and grounded, preserved as museum pieces. The first, CCCPL 5611, the prototype, the very aircraft that carried Nikita Khrushchev to Andrews Air Force Base in September 1959. The plane that was too tall for American stairs, the plane whose emergency ladder became an icon of Cold War theatre. It sits today at the Central Air Force Museum at Monino, just outside Moscow. The glass nose still faces forward. The emergency ladder is somewhere aboard, presumably. The sleeping compartments, whether they've been restored or simply left as empty spaces, are silent. No blankets, no reading lamps, no chef, no passengers. The second, CCCP-76490, displayed at the Ulyanovsk Aircraft Museum. And here, a detail with its own quiet poetry. Parked beside it is the sole surviving Tu-116, the Bombay backup. The aircraft with Kremlin office passenger compartments installed where nuclear weapons were designed to ride. Built in secret in case the Tu-114 wasn't ready for Khrushchev's trip to America, never used. 2 aircraft side by side in a museum in the Russian heartland, the weapon and its civilian descendant kept together. The third, CCCP-76485. At the Aviation Museum of the National Aviation University in Kryvyi Rih, Ukraine. Of the 3 survivors, its future is perhaps the least certain. An artifact of Soviet aviation history, sitting in a country that has, since 2022, been at war with the nation that built it. What becomes of a Soviet airplane in a Ukrainian museum during a Russian war is a question that has no comfortable answer. Here is what the Tu-114 was. It was a nuclear bomber, reimagined as a passenger airplane. It was the largest and fastest propeller-driven airliner ever built. A record it holds to this day, more than 60 years later, because no one has attempted to surpass it. It was an aircraft that carried over 6 million passengers in 15 years of service, with exactly 1 fatal accident. And that caused not by any failure of the aircraft, but by a snowbank on a Moscow runway. It set 32 world speed records. It flew the longest non-stop scheduled routes on Earth. It was escorted by American fighter jets, whose pilots couldn't believe a propeller aircraft could move so fast. It was conceived as a Cold War prestige symbol, built to upstage the Americans, flown by a Soviet premier too stubborn to use the safer backup. It was operational in Cuba where it defied American blockades, and in Tokyo, where it bridged an ideological divide. It was flown by pilots who had to eat well before each flight, because the controls demanded it, navigated by a man sitting in a glass bombardier's nose, with the earth rushing toward him, serviced by a chef, cooking meals in a kitchen beneath the passengers' feet. And inside this machine of records and raw power and geopolitical theatre, someone thought to install beds. That's the detail that stays with you. Not the speed, remarkable as it was, not the range, extraordinary as it was, not even the noise, unforgettable as it was. The beds, the reading lamps, the curtains, the blankets, distributed after 2 hours of flight by cabin crew who made up the berths with the practiced efficiency of sleeping car attendants on the Moscow to Leningrad overnight. The small table between the bunks, the warm circle of light from a lamp mounted on the wall. The vibration coming up through the mattress, steady and rhythmic, like the pulse of a heart much larger than your own. Someone in the Tupolev Design Bureau in the Soviet Union of the late 1950s, a country that prioritized production over comfort, function over beauty, the collective over the individual, sat down and decided that passengers crossing the vast distances of that enormous nation deserved more than transportation. They deserved rest. They deserved a meal, cooked fresh, served on china. They deserved a tablecloth. They deserved a reading lamp and a curtain and a blanket and a pillow. They deserved, in the middle of the sky, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a machine whose ancestors were designed to end civilization, a few hours of something resembling home. And they made this decision inside an aircraft whose wings and engines and landing gear had been built to carry nuclear weapons to the other side of the world. It's an extraordinary thing, a contradiction that shouldn't work, and yet for 15 years did. War and domesticity, thunder and bed linens, the most powerful turboprop engines ever built, and a reading lamp that cast a small circle of warm light across a pillow at 25,000 feet. A dumbwaiter carrying soup upward through the floor. 6 million passengers felt the vibration of those engines through their berths. 6 million passengers ate meals that rose through the cabin floor on a mechanical elevator the size of a cabinet. 6 million passengers shouted across restaurant tables or surrendered to the noise and let silence be their companion. 6 million passengers descended steep stairs at airports that weren't built for an airplane this size, collected their coats from the wardrobe and walked out into Moscow or Delhi or Havana or Khabarovsk, their ears ringing, their memories already forming. Some of them are still alive. They remember the sound, that deep, grinding, supersonic howl that penetrated everything. They remember the beds, the unexpected luxury of a blanket at altitude, the reading lamp, the curtain drawn against the cabin light. They remember the particular sensation of sleeping inside something so loud that it transcended noise and became something else, a presence, a vibration, a kind of silence that only constant sound can create. 3 Tu-114’s remain. They sit in museums like in Monino, in Ulyanovsk, in Kryvyi Rih, where visitors walk past them, perhaps without stopping, on their way to something louder or faster or more obviously spectacular. The glass noses face forward toward runways that no longer receive them. The propellers are still, those massive 5.5-meter blades that once turned fast enough to break the sound barrier, now motionless, their tips pointed at the ground. The sleeping compartments, if they survive at all, hold no sheets, no blankets, no passengers drifting off above the curve of the earth. The dumbwaiter carries nothing. The kitchen is cold, but the record stands, the fastest propeller-driven aircraft in history. 32 world speed records, 6 million passengers, 1 accident, and inside it, inside all that noise and power and ambition and brute Soviet engineering, beds, and a reading lamp and a blanket, and a chef cooking dinner beneath the floor. That's the story of the Tu-114 Russia. A bomber that became a sleeper train. A weapon that became, for a few hours at a time, for 6 million people who trusted it enough to close their eyes at 500 miles an hour, a kind of home. And what a strange, magnificent, thundering thing it was.